Hello, welcome. I'm Dr. Ross Thompson of the Psychology Department at UC Davis, and I'm here to talk with you a little bit today about the self strand of the social emotional development domain. You know, the TK year is an amazing time for children to learn further about who they are, about their personalities, about the strengths and some of the challenges that they experience, and also to learn about all the internal things that are going on within them, the emotions that make them feel so passionate at times, the goals, the desires, the needs that can sometimes be really, really confusing. And transitional kindergarten can be a wonderful opportunity for kids to pursue further that remarkable exploration of who they are, how they compare with other people, what makes them unique and special, and how they can bring that into each learning opportunity they have. You know, in some respects, children are engaged in that process all throughout their lives. The picture that you see here on the slide of little Emma at 9 months old watching her mirror image is a reflection of how very early this process of self-discovery starts because really this little girl, this 9-month-old baby who's caught her mirror image in the mirror, has no idea that this is herself who's looking back at her. Emma's delight as she looks back at her mother is the delight of a baby who's discovered another playmate, who's responding immediately to everything that Emma says and does. Emma has no sense, in other words, of what she looks like, of what she can do, and as a result, she experiences the mirror image as simply a playful baby. And so, although she's come a long way, by the time she reaches transitional kindergarten, she still has a long way to go. And the mirror image is nevertheless a wonderful metaphor for understanding some of the ways in which that unfolding sense of self continues to develop. Because for centuries, psychologists have talked about the development of the self as if our self is developing as a looking glass self. That we learn about who we are, about our characteristics, our strengths and weaknesses, in part because of how other people are responding to us and what they're seeing in us. So as if we're looking in a mirror, we are seeing who we are through the reflected evaluations and judgments and appraisals of other people. You know, some person may develop a strong interest in athletic endeavors, in part because of the ways that others have applauded her athletic achievements in the past. Whereas another person struggles for years with self-doubt because of the ways that others have tended to underestimate their accomplishments and their capabilities. So this is true of us, and it's especially true of young children. In that transitional kindergarten year, children are finding out about themselves in part by what they're hearing, and how others are responding to them, and in this way forming a sense of self. There are some examples of how this process occurs that I want to share with you from our own lab that really give us some sense of the tremendous power by which the things that people say to children, the ways they respond to them, help to shape their own sense of self, their emotions, their reactions to events, and the reactions to events that they'll be making in the future. One good example for us comes from an instance in which in the lab a mother was talking with her child about an upcoming dentist visit. And as you might guess, for a kindergarten child, a trip to the dentist, if they haven't already had one, can be a somewhat harrowing experience. Somebody looking in your mouth and doing things that might be really uncomfortable and painful. But this mother described it instead as teeth tickling. She said, you're going to go to the dentist and they're going to look in your mouth and they're going to try to tickle your teeth. And so later on, when one of our experimenters interviewed the child about what her trip to the dentist was going to be like, well, the experimenter said, how do you think you'll feel when you go to the dentist? And the child said, happy. And if something tickles my teeth, I'm going to laugh. That representation of what that trip to the dentist was going to be like completely reshaped that child's expectations for what was going to occur. You know, a little bit closer to home, we also recorded conversations in which mothers talked with their children at age 5 about what the first day of kindergarten was going to be like. And here's one of those mother-child conversations relating to the beginning of kindergarten. The mother asks her child, are you scared at all, or are you just excited about going to kindergarten? And the child responded matter-of-factly, I'm excited. And the mother said, well, are you not scared at all? The child said, no. And the mother said, well, they didn't think so, because, you know, some people are scared to go to kindergarten. Well, the mother's message had gotten through by the end of that interview, so that later on in the procedure, when one of our experimenters happened to talk with the child about the first day of kindergarten, the child's own expectation had been completely reshaped. The experimenter said, so how do you think you'll feel when you go to kindergarten? And the child said, scared, because maybe I don't know who I'm going to have to play with. The child had gotten the message that being scared is what's going to happen, although she didn't quite understand why that should be the case. It's not only understanding their feelings and understanding their personalities by which children learn about themselves through the looking glass self, through the appraisals and conversations and judgments and evaluations that others make, but it's also how children learn about their capabilities and why they achieve or don't achieve as they do in a transitional kindergarten classroom. Consider, for example, the kinds of feedback that children get when they have done particularly well. Sometimes we might respond, "You're so smart." And so the child gets the idea that they're accomplishing what they are because they have what it takes. They've got this natural brilliance. Or another teacher might respond, "You really worked hard on that," conveying to the child the sense that it was my hard effort that resulted in my being able to do as well as I did. Or another teacher might simply say, "Can you tell me more about what you did?" letting the child make the appraisal of their success or lack of it. And what research has shown is that these different ways we have of responding to children's achievement really do make a difference in terms of how children think about their strengths and weaknesses, and also about what they have to do in the future if they want to do an especially good job. Conversations like this are important not only in shaping a sense of self, a sense of emotion, a sense of achievement, but also are important to the development of moral and social understanding. Here's a longer conversation that came from one of our lab visits in which we asked the mother and her child to recall a recent event involving strong emotion. And I'll read this to you. The mother asks, "So what happened, honey, when Mom said we had to go?" And the child responds, because she remembers the event, she says, "I felt awful." Mother said, "And what did you do? Do you remember?" The child says, "I cried and fussed." And the mother says, "And what else? Did you throw yourself on the floor?" Mother obviously remembers what took place. The child says, "No, I kicked my legs." "Yes, you did. And what did Mom say?" And the child remembers that. "I don't want you up there screaming." Mother says, "Right, and now here comes the lesson, because when we're a guest at somebody's house, the polite thing to do is to say thank you before we go, not to kick and scream, isn't it?" The child says, "Yeah." The mother says, "Now when you kick and scream, what happens with other people? How do you think Onia felt then?" Onia was the grandmother who they were visiting. The child said she felt a little sad. And mother says, "You think so? I bet you're right. And what did she do?" And mother says, "I don't know." Suddenly a memory lapse. And the mother says she took the girls and went upstairs so we could be by ourselves, so we could work out our problem. In this conversation, mother is just filling in a lot of the gaps in helping the child make connections between how Onia responded and why she responded as she did, how it related to the child's actions, what was appropriate conduct in that situation, what wasn't, and eventually helping the child understand the strong emotions and the strong reactions to those emotions that took place in this family confrontation. And although our research is focused on how these things take place in the context of parent-child conversation, usually mother-child conversation, we have every reason to believe that these kinds of conversations are also provocative to children in their social and emotional development in a transitional kindergarten classroom as well. That when teachers take the time to talk with children about their experiences, to unfold, as this mother did, sort of why something happened in conflict with a peer or when the child fell apart emotionally when the block tower fell down. When a teacher helps a child make the connections between events, that feeds the development of emotional understanding of social competence in ways that nothing else can do. Because in doing so, a teacher is putting language to these confusing internal experiences that a child is aware of, that they know how it's affecting their behavior, but understanding what these feelings are, what these experiences are, can be still tremendously daunting and tremendously confusing to kids. So the mother says, "Now, when you kick and scream, what happens to other people? How do you think Onia felt then?" Onia was the grandmother that the mother and child were visiting. And the child said she felt a little sad. And the mother says, "You think so? I bet you're right. And what did she do?" And the child says, "I don't know," a memory gap. The mother fills it in. Mother says she took the girls and went upstairs so we could be by ourselves, so we could work out our problem. What the mother is doing in this conversation is helping to elaborate, to fill in the gaps, to provide depth and understanding to what had obviously been an emotional family confrontation that had taken place just a few days earlier. And in so doing, the mother is is feeding the child's developing understanding of emotions and the effects they have on people and why people respond as they do and what is appropriate conduct and why is it appropriate and how does your behavior affect other people and how do other people respond in that way. Children in transitional kindergarten are passionate to develop this kind of understanding because they realize that it's these kinds of reactions that help them to understand why people act the way they do. And yet, because those feelings, those thoughts, those motives, those drives, those needs and goals are invisible and are often intangible and very confusing to children, such conversations provide great understanding that they seek. And although our research is focused on mother-child conversations, we have every reason to think that these kinds of conversations taking place between a transitional kindergarten teacher and a child can have very, very similar effects on children's understanding and their social competence. That as a teacher takes the time to talk with a child about an emotional experience they've had, falling apart, for example, emotionally when the block tower collapsed, or a child's observation or engagement in peer conflict, that the teacher's efforts to put words to those feelings, to communicate the different goals that might have led to one child taking off after another, can help children develop that kind of understanding of themselves and eventually apply it to their own social experiences. Well, there is one area in which a child's development is often a source of frustration and at times of conflict for the adults who are close to that child. And that has to do with the area of self-regulation. When we are turning to children and saying, pay attention, focus your thoughts, control your emotions, use your words, we're responding to the self-regulatory gaps that are so characteristic of children at this age. And they're really important to how children are able to function in a transitional kindergarten classroom. You know, when teachers are asked whether a child is school ready or not, and for those children who aren't, they're asked why, lack of self-regulatory capability, the child's difficulty in paying attention, focusing their thought, following instructions, controlling their emotions are often the most important reason why kids are described as being not school ready. And when teachers are asked to talk about what are the challenges of children in their classroom, often it's these self-regulatory challenges that teachers most often identify. And this problem derives from something that we have discovered in the area of brain development, about the development of self-regulation. And quite simply, that self-regulation develops very, very slowly. I've highlighted in this slide one of several areas of the brain that govern a child's ability to exert self-control. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this and several other areas of the brain in that general region have a lot to do with a child's ability to focus their thinking, to concentrate their attention, to be able to follow instructions, to manage their emotions, to control their impulses. But the problem is that these areas of the brain have a very extended maturational timetable. They begin maturing at about 12 months of age, but they don't finish the process until around age 24. And this means that the 5-year-olds in our transitional kindergarten classrooms are only taking their baby steps in the brain's development of self-regulation. We know this from developmental neuroscience, but we also know it from studying the development of self-regulation in terms of what researchers who study children call the development of executive functions. So let me talk with you a little bit about what we've learned about executive functions. Executive functions are based on the development of a set of cognitive processes based in the brain that enable self-controlled, goal-directed thought and behavior. The easiest way to think about executive functions is that they're like the air traffic controller of the mind. And we certainly, all of us as adults, need an air traffic controller of our mind, don't we? The ability, for example, to be able to make plans for what we're going to do after work at the same time that we're talking with a supervisor, to be listening to a conversation with our partner or our spouse and at the same time be thinking about the novel that we're looking forward to reading, the ability to be on a phone conversation but to also be doing other things. All of this requires a mental air traffic controller. The ability to pay attention how another person is responding to our conversation as we're thinking about what we're saying requires that mental gymnastics to be able to keep all these different things ordered and organized. That air traffic controller is only beginning to develop in young children. And in truth be told, part of that is because executive functions are not just one thing that develops, but there are actually three executive functions that are important here. Let me describe them to you. One of the executive functions consists of inhibition, this ability, for example, to resist a strong inclination to do one thing, but instead to do something that's more appropriate or more productive. So inhibition is involved in things as simple as young children learning to raise their hand instead of immediately blurting out the answer to a question. Inhibition is involved in a child's ability to resist retaliating immediately when they're provoked by a peer, but instead to come up with a more appropriate solution. Inhibition is really, really hard for our children. Another executive function is what we call cognitive flexibility, and that is the ability to switch perspective, attention, or mental focus, to adapt to changes in the schedule or to make a different plan as opposed to the plan that we've been embarking on. Cognitive flexibility is involved in being able to do creative problem solving and to come up with creative solutions to social conflict. All that involves that kind of cognitive flexibility. And sometimes when we think that young children are egocentric, it's really because they're not capable of the cognitive flexibility to switch perspectives easily. And finally, the third of the executive functions is called working memory, the ability to hold information in mind while mentally working on it. And working memory is involved in everything from being able to follow a story narrative as somebody is reading or telling a story to you, to being able to follow multi-step instructions and be able to follow first one set of instructions and then the second set while keeping in mind the ultimate goal that you're working toward. So the question for us then is, with self-regulation being based on brain regions that are very slow to mature, so our children in transitional kindergarten are only at the beginning steps of the brain's development of self-control. And with these different executive functions that all have to mature but are maturing slowly in children at 5 years of age, what are the ways in which we can contribute to helping children develop self-regulatory skills? And the first suggestion I have is a lot of patience. We have to be willing to understand what children are capable of and to create an environment in which they can do the best they can with our assistance without expecting too much. One of the things the research is showing us is that both parents and teachers tend to expect greater self-control of children of this age than they really genuinely are capable of in terms of where they are in brain development. We can help them then if we create a classroom and a set of routines organized around developmentally appropriate expectations and a recognition that there are individual differences among children in their capacities for self-control. By developmentally appropriate expectations, I'm meaning that a 3-hour circle time is probably not a good idea for 5-year-olds. And by recognizing that there are individual differences, we recognize that even though there are those children in your classroom who do everything you ask them to do, who never fail to pay attention, who are always on task, that does not necessarily mean there's something wrong with all the rest of the kids who are not doing that. It may well mean, in fact, research seems to suggest, that those kids who are always cooperating, paying attention, on task, may have a temperamental assist here that the other children do not have. But they're all within the range of capability for executive function, for self-regulation for this age. We can also urge children to use their words to regulate their actions and their thinking. We often encourage them to use words to manage their emotions, and there's good reason behind that. Because a child who's in the midst of an emotional meltdown, who's also having to think of the words that are necessary to convey how they're feeling, is having to manage those emotions in the context of marshaling the appropriate vocabulary. But words are a tremendously valuable self-regulatory resource for other activities as well. If children are engaged in a multi-step project, like a science project planting seeds, then having them talk through the steps that they're needing to do it as they're doing it can help them maintain their focus and keep their cognitive attention on what they're trying to accomplish and how they're doing it. So you might hear children who have been instructed in this way saying to themselves, first I dig a hole for the seed, and now I put the seed in, and now I cover it up with dirt, and now I'm going to find water to help the seed grow. Talking yourself through instructions like that can help keep children on task. Guiding children with do rather than don't statements can also contribute to their self-regulation. And the reason for this is very simple, that the parts of the brain that help children enact behavior are well mature in 5-year-olds. But as we've already seen, the parts of the brain that help them inhibit behavior are less mature. And therefore, if we guide children by telling them what to do, not what not to do, they're more likely to be able to comply. To be able to say, walk with slow steps, rather than saying, don't run. To be able to say, use your quiet indoor voice, please, rather than saying, stop shouting, can more likely result in children being able to do what we're asking them to do. To provide options for children to manage themselves, such as a place to get away, can help them be able to exert self-regulation at a point when things are beginning to get a little bit out of control and they need a chance to time out and reconstitute themselves. And that's why having a small, quiet getaway area with pillows, with storybooks to read can be tremendously helpful for self-regulation for children of this age. To break up instructions into manageable and memorable chunks, rather than giving children a long list of things to do and then being surprised that they can't accomplish it all, use a song. Use guided instructions to help work children through the procedures they need to do in order to transition, for example, from one set of activities to the other. To model with explanations your own self-control, especially your emotional self-control, your cognitive flexibility, to your attentional focus, your efforts to remember, that children can benefit by watching what you are doing to help keep focused, to remember something that you've forgotten, and as a result begin to be able to use these practices themselves. Suggest to children strategies for inhibition and encourage their own cognitive flexibility. In conversations with children, especially when they're in pitched battle with another child over a favorite tricycle, for example, to help children think about alternative things that can be done, alternative ways of resolving this conflict can help instill that kind of cognitive flexibility that might not come naturally to them. And finally, to give children experience in making, monitoring, and applying rules, to help children have the experience of being able to understand how rules that they're going to be using to govern their own conduct come into being, and help them both applying the rules to themselves and also as they're monitoring others to watch others' conduct in relation to those rules as well. I hope this is helpful in thinking about the development of self during this remarkable transitional kindergarten year, and I thank you for being here with me.